The Bible had sat on the lowest shelf of the church archive for as long as anyone could remember. Its leather cover was cracked and curling at the edges, its once gilded spine now a muted brown. Dust clung to every crease, and the faint smell of incense and age seemed to rise from its pages. Eleanor Whitcomb, the town's unassuming librarian, had handled hundreds of such books before, cataloguing, restoring, and quietly returning them to their places without fanfare. But this morning was different. Her thin fingers traced the edges of the parchment as she prepared to make a note of its condition. That's when she noticed it. Tiny, deliberate marks running along the outer margin of a page in the Gospel of John. They were not letters in any alphabet she recognized, nor the idle doodles of a bored scribe. They were sharper, almost like the tiny notches someone might make on wood to count days or track something unseen. She leaned closer, adjusting her glasses, her breath fogging the fragile page. The marks were faint, faded almost to nothing, yet their pattern was too precise to be accidental. Eleanor felt a small thrill, an instinct whispering that this Bible was no ordinary relic. Her heart thudded in her chest, the sound loud in the stillness of the archive. Eleanor had always been the type to notice what others overlooked. It was why she'd taken this job in the first place. She preferred the company of books to people, finding comfort in the quiet rustle of pages and the faint scent of aged ink. But as she studied those strange marks, she sensed she was standing at the threshold of something far greater than any simple repair or cataloguing task. The church bell struck 10, the sound echoing through the stone walls. Somewhere above, a custodian's broom scratched along the nave floor. Eleanor glanced toward the heavy oak door leading out to the main chapel. No one would disturb her here. She bent closer still, following the marks down the margin. They seemed to appear only on certain pages, never at random, always aligned in a purposeful sequence. She thought about Father Thomas, the elderly priest who had entrusted her with the archive's upkeep. He often spoke of the church's history, of donations from noble families centuries ago, and of the countless pilgrim hands that had turned these pages. Could one of those donors have left a hidden message, and if so, why? Eleanor carefully set the Bible on a velvet-lined table, turning the pages with painstaking care. Each new margin brought more of the same tiny glyphs. A rhythm emerged, groups of symbols separated by blank space, repeating like verses in a poem. The realization made her pulse quicken. It wasn't random, it was a code. The notion felt absurd, yet thrilling. A code in a Bible? That was the stuff of novels and whispered legends, not something a librarian in a sleepy English town stumbled upon during her Tuesday shift. She bit her lip, glancing again at the closed door. If she told someone, they might dismiss her, perhaps even take the book away before she could learn more. Her mind flicked through half-remembered stories, rumors of the Knights Templar, of secret messages hidden in holy texts, of treasures lost to time. She had read enough to know that codes often required keys, and that without one, deciphering them could take months, even years. But she also knew something else. Such secrets were rarely left without reason. She closed the Bible gently and rested her hand on its worn cover. The leather was warm beneath her palm, as if holding on to the centuries of hands that had touched it. She could almost feel those hands urging her forward, whispering that the truth was within reach, if only she dared to follow. Eleanor straightened, glancing once more toward the oak door. Beyond it lay the ordinary world, with its familiar streets and predictable routines. But here, in the quiet dimness of the archive, she felt as if she had just opened a door to another century, and she wasn't ready to close it. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Eleanor Whitcomb's life. The marks in the margin called to her again, and Eleanor, though she did not yet know it, had already made her choice. Eleanor spent the rest of the morning pretending to work, though her thoughts never strayed far from the strange Bible. Every time she walked past the table where it lay, her eyes darted to it, her pulse quickening. The afternoon light slanted through the high, stained glass windows, casting ripples of red and gold across the floor. But she barely noticed. Her mind was fixed on the markings, those sharp, deliberate strokes that seemed to defy centuries of silence. When the church bell tolled 4, signaling the end of her shift, she didn't leave. Instead, she bolted the archive door, slid into the chair by the velvet-lined table, and drew the Bible toward her. She pulled a magnifying glass from her satchel and began studying the first sequence of marks. Up close, she saw faint indentations around the ink, as if they'd been carved with a fine point rather than written with a quill. She flipped to the next page with shaking fingers. Again, more symbols, perfectly aligned. But the moment she tried to sketch them in her notebook, she realized she was lost. There was no resemblance to Latin, Greek, or any medieval script she had seen before. They were jagged, geometric, almost like a map reduced to abstract shapes. A pang of frustration cut through her excitement. Without some reference, these marks would remain locked away, their meaning just out of reach. She thought of Father Thomas, but dismissed the idea immediately. He was devout and kind, but anything that hinted at unorthodox interpretations of Scripture made him uneasy. The last thing she needed was for the Bible to be taken from her, for safekeeping. That night, she carried her sketches home, unable to resist the pull of the mystery. Her small flat above the bakery smelled faintly of yeast and cinnamon, the air warm from the ovens below. She laid her notes out on the kitchen table, switching on the lamp. The marks glared back at her, challenging her to understand them. Hours passed. She cross-referenced medieval cipher patterns, flipped through dusty reference books, even scanned old photographs of marginalia she'd taken from other manuscripts. But nothing matched. The shapes seemed designed to mislead, to resist any straightforward translation. By midnight, Eleanor's eyes ached. She pressed her palms into her face, trying to think. Then a thought struck her. Perhaps it wasn't a language at all. Perhaps it was a code based on position, like a grid or numbering system. She pulled the Bible from her bag and studied how the marks lined up with specific words in the text. Her breath caught. On one page, the third mark aligned with the word sanctus. On another, a symbol pointed toward lux, holy light. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed her magnifying glass again and went over the sequence carefully. The words the marks highlighted formed a strange, poetic string when placed together, fragmented but deliberate. It was no coincidence. Someone had used the Bible's own text as the canvas for a hidden message. She barely noticed the creak of the floorboards until it was too late. Eleanor jumped, knocking over her mug of tea as her neighbour, Mr. Holloway, stepped into the kitchen doorway. The old man chuckled apologetically, holding up a loaf of bread from the bakery downstairs. "Working late again, Miss Whitcomb?" he asked, glancing at the spread of papers. She forced a smile and nodded, quickly covering the Bible with her notes. "Just a little cataloguing." But as soon as he left, she uncovered the book again, staring at the symbols until her eyes burned. She was closer. She could feel it. Yet the meaning remained just beyond her grasp, like a word on the tip of her tongue. She didn't see it yet, but the walls around her were beginning to close in. Somewhere in the quiet streets beyond her window, there were still those who watched for such signs, people who had waited lifetimes for the wrong eyes to find the wrong marks. And Eleanor Whitcomb had just set their world stirring. The next morning, Eleanor carried the Bible across town to the university, her satchel pressed close to her side as if it contained fragile glass. The crisp air bit at her cheeks and the cobblestone streets rang with her hurried steps. She had decided, after hours of restless pacing, that she needed another pair of eyes, someone who might recognize the script. Dr. Lionel Greaves was the only person she trusted enough to consult. A semi-retired historian who lectured occasionally on medieval orders, he was known for his encyclopedic knowledge of religious history and his eccentric disdain for academic politeness. Eleanor had met him years ago when she had helped catalogue part of his private manuscript collection. She found him in his office, surrounded by teetering stacks of books and yellowing maps. He squinted at her over the rim of his spectacles as she laid the Bible on his desk. "Well," he said, fingers already drifting toward the margin she'd marked with a ribbon. "This is either a very good forgery or something quite unusual." Eleanor's breath caught as he examined the marks, leaning so close his nose nearly brushed the page. His expression tightened almost immediately. He snapped the Bible shut and pushed it toward her. "Where did you find this?" he asked sharply. "In the church archive," she replied, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "It's been there for centuries, I think. Why? Do you know what the marks mean?" Greaves leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her. "You could say that. They're a form of shorthand used by the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, better known to you as the Knights Templar. Very few examples survive, and for good reason. The code was designed to be read only by those who had taken oaths that bound them to secrecy, even unto death. The air in the room seemed to thin. "But it's just marking in a Bible," Eleanor said, though she heard the uncertainty in her own voice. "Not just markings," Greaves said. "You have no idea what you're holding. If the Templars left a message in Scripture, it would not be about trivial matters. It could point to, well, anything from the location of relics to instructions for their guardians. And if certain people learned you had it—" He stopped, studying her with an intensity that made her shiver. "They would come for it." Eleanor forced a laugh, but it came out brittle. "You make it sound like some conspiracy thriller." Greaves didn't smile. "This isn't a game, Miss Whitcomb. You'd be wise to put that book back where you found it. Lock the door and forget you ever saw it." She tried to read his face, searching for the hint of exaggeration she might expect from an eccentric scholar. But there was only a weary seriousness in his eyes, and beneath that, something else. Fear? "I'll think about it," she said, tucking the Bible back into her satchel. Greaves leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You won't be able to stop thinking about it. That's the danger. Curiosity has undone more people than malice ever could. Remember that before you turn another page." Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering yellow leaves along the university steps. Eleanor stood there for a moment, the weight of his warning pressing down on her. She knew she should listen. She should put the book back, seal it away, and never look at it again. But as her hand tightened on the satchel strap, she knew she wouldn't. The marks in the margin had already taken root in her mind, and there was no undoing it. That night, Eleanor waited until the last lamplight in the street below her flat had gone dark. She sat at her kitchen table, the Bible before her, its pages whispering faintly as she turned them. Greaves's warning still echoed in her mind, but it only seemed to sharpen her resolve. Whatever the Templars had hidden, they had gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve it. And now, centuries later, the secret had fallen into her hands. She lit a second lamp, pulling the glow tighter around the table, as if building a private circle where no shadow could intrude. Her magnifying glass hovered above the first sequence of marks. Tonight, she would stop sketching and start decoding. She recalled Greaves mentioning oaths and guardians. If these marks were truly shorthand, then their meaning might hinge on patterns rather than words. Eleanor flipped back to the beginning of the Gospel of John and began charting where each symbol appeared, noting their proximity to specific words. Within an hour, she had a growing list of Latin terms: sanctus, lux, crux, custos, holy, light, cross, guardian. Her pen scratched furiously against the paper. Each page seemed to yield more fragments, and the more she uncovered, the more a structure began to take shape. Words connected to form half-sentences. The light, beneath the guardian's cross, shall reveal. Her heart thudded. This was no liturgy. It was a set of instructions. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window panes. She barely noticed. She was chasing the thread now, darting between pages, fitting the pieces together. By the time the church bell struck midnight, the instructions were nearly complete. One final sequence remained, its symbols clustered tightly near the end of Revelation. Eleanor's eyes burned as she studied them. When at last she deciphered the final line, she froze. It was a set of coordinates, though in a medieval form, describing distance and direction from a known landmark. The ruined abbey of St. Aldwyn, deep in the countryside, long abandoned. She sat back, the reality sinking in. If this was correct, the Templars had left their final clue in plain sight, encoded in a Bible that had survived the centuries unnoticed. And those coordinates, they were only a few hours' drive away. Her excitement was edged with unease. Greaves's warning replayed in her mind. If certain people learned you had it, they would come for it. But there was no one else here, no one else to see. If she went quietly, no one would know until she was back. A floorboard creaked above her, breaking her train of thought. She looked up sharply. The flat above hers had been empty for weeks. She held her breath, listening. Silence. Just the groan of old wood, she told herself. But when she rose to draw the curtains, she caught the briefest movement across the street. A figure slipping into shadow, coat collar high against the wind. Eleanor's skin prickled. She stayed at the window until the street was empty, then turned back to the table. Her hands were steady as she closed the Bible, slid it into her satchel, and locked the clasp. She knew, as surely as she knew her own name, that she would not sleep tonight. The code had spoken. Tomorrow she would follow it. The road to St. Aldwyn's wound like a pale ribbon through the autumn countryside, flanked by hedgerows that shivered in the morning wind. Eleanor's old hatchback rattled over potholes, its engine protesting every incline. She kept one hand on the wheel, the other gripping the satchel on the passenger seat. Inside, the Bible lay wrapped in cloth, the coordinates etched firmly in her mind. The abbey appeared suddenly beyond a rise, its crumbling towers reaching like skeletal fingers toward a grey sky. Time had eaten away at its walls, leaving only fragments of archways and the jagged silhouette of the nave. The surrounding fields lay deserted, save for a scattering of crows that circled lazily overhead. Eleanor parked beside a rusted gate, the silence pressing in as she stepped out. Every footfall on the damp grass seemed unnaturally loud. She scanned the ruins, her breath catching at the thought that she might be standing where Templar knights had once walked, guarding secrets that had outlived them all. Inside the abbey, the air was cold and damp, thick with the scent of moss and stone. Shafts of light spilled through the roofless nave, illuminating patches of wildflowers and broken flagstones. She followed the main aisle, her boots scraping softly, until she reached the altar, a block of weathered stone streaked with lichen. She drew out her notes, tracing the coordinates again. The message in the Bible had been precise, beneath the Guardian's cross. Her eyes roamed the ruin until she spotted it, half buried in the chancel floor, a carved cross worn almost smooth by centuries of feet. Kneeling, she ran her fingers along the edges of the carving. The stone felt colder here, the lines deeper than the surrounding floor. A tremor of anticipation ran through her as she pressed at the edges, testing for movement. Nothing. Eleanor straightened, frowning. The Templars had not been careless. If they had hidden something here, it would be well concealed. She scanned the nave again, her gaze catching on the base of a toppled pillar nearby. Moss clung to it in thick sheets, but beneath she could just make out the faint outline of another cross, smaller, almost hidden. Her breath quickened. She dropped to her knees, clawing away the moss until her nails scraped stone. This cross was different, carved into a circular slab that didn't quite match the surrounding floor. She pressed her palms against it and pushed. It shifted just enough to confirm her suspicion. With a grunt, she heaved it aside, revealing a narrow opening. A damp, earthen smell rose from below. The hole was just wide enough for her to lower herself through. Her heart pounded as she retrieved a flashlight from her satchel, its beam slicing through the darkness beneath. A ladder descended into a space that looked untouched for centuries. She hesitated only a moment before swinging her legs into the opening. The wood creaked under her weight, but held. Step by step, she descended into the cold, damp air until her boots touched solid ground. The beam of her flashlight swept over the chamber, stone walls arched like the ribs of a great beast, and a floor littered with fragments of pottery and rusted metal. In the center, a raised platform stood draped in dust. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She had found it. Whatever the Templars had guarded for so long lay just ahead, hidden from the world above. Eleanor's flashlight beam quivered slightly in her hand as she stepped toward the platform. The air was damp and cold enough to sting her lungs, carrying the scent of earth long undisturbed. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots, the faint drip of water from some unseen crevice above. The platform was carved from the same pale stone as the abbey above, though here it was unweathered, its edges sharp. Upon it sat a heavy slab, unmarked, save for a single, engraved cross at its center. The cross was unmistakably Templar, the flared ends of its arms, the symmetry precise and deliberate. Eleanor set her satchel down and ran her fingertips over the engraving. The stone was cool, the grooves shallow but expertly cut. She circled the platform slowly, her flashlight sweeping the shadows. On the far side, half hidden by centuries of dust, she spotted a small iron ring set into the slab's edge. Her heart quickened. She hooked her fingers into the ring and pulled. At first, the slab refused to move. Then, with a grinding groan, it shifted, revealing a hollow beneath. The smell that rose from within was older than memory, a mixture of dry parchment, aged wood, and something faintly metallic. Inside lay a chest no larger than a travelling trunk. Its oak panels were darkened with age, bound in tarnished iron. Across its lid was a painted red cross, faded but still vivid enough to command respect. She reached out, brushing away the dust, and felt a shiver run through her. The chest was locked, a thick iron clasp sealing it shut. Eleanor glanced around the chamber, her flashlight beam catching on something glinting in the dirt. A small, ornate key, its bow shaped like a cross. She picked it up, feeling the cold weight of the metal in her palm. Her breath caught as the key slid into the lock with a perfect fit. The mechanism turned with a click that echoed off the stone walls. Slowly, almost reverently, she lifted the lid. The beam of her flashlight revealed a trove that seemed to hum with history, reliquaries of gold and silver, each delicately wrought, a dagger with a jeweled hilt. Folded cloth that might once have been a banner, and, resting atop a velvet cushion, a sealed glass vial containing a fragment of wood. Dark, splintered, and bound with golden thread. She stared, her mind reeling. This was no mere treasure, it was the heart of Templar legend. Relics of a faith that had been hunted, scattered, and shrouded in secrecy for centuries. The air around her seemed heavier now, as if aware that she had crossed some invisible threshold. A sound broke the silence.
Eleanor froze. It was faint, like the scuff of a boot on stone, coming from somewhere above. She snapped off her flashlight, plunging the chamber into darkness. Her pulse roared in her ears as she strained to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a muffled creak. Someone was in the abbey. She closed the chest with trembling hands, slipping the key into her pocket. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to hide, to protect what she'd found.
She had no idea who was above, or how they knew she was here, but the coordinates in the Bible had not been waiting for her alone. Eleanor's breath came in shallow bursts as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall. The darkness felt alive now, wrapping around her as the footsteps above grew heavier, more deliberate. Whoever it was, they were searching. A beam of light sliced through the trapdoor opening, probing the chamber below. She ducked low, shielding her eyes. The light swept across the walls, lingering a fraction too long on the platform where the chest sat. A voice, male, deep, and clipped, called down, "We know you're here." Her pulse spiked. She didn't answer. Instead, she slid the chest behind a jut of stone in the corner, covering it hastily with a moth-eaten tarp she'd found among the debris. The trapdoor creaked as someone began descending the ladder. The first boot hit the earthen floor with a thud, then the second. A tall man emerged from the beam of his own flashlight, broad-shouldered, wearing a long, dark coat, his eyes locked on her instantly. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice devoid of surprise, as if he'd expected her. Eleanor's mind raced. "Who are you?" His gaze flicked toward the tarp, just for a moment. "A caretaker," he replied. "One of the few left who remember the old vows, that Bible you took. It was never meant to be read by uninitiated hands." She squared her shoulders,
forcing steel into her voice. "If you're a caretaker, then you know these relics belong to history, not to shadows." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "History isn't kind, Miss Whitcomb. It devours the unprepared. What's locked away down here is dangerous, not for what it is, but for what people believe it to be. Wars have been started over less." He took a step closer, the edge of his coat brushing the dirt. "I'm going to ask you once."
"Hand me the key." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the cool metal in her pocket. She could feel the weight of the vial, the dagger, the gold pressing on her conscience. If she gave it up now, she'd never know the truth. But if she kept it, she didn't know what that would cost her. Her voice came out low but steady. "No." Something flickered in his expression, annoyance, then calculation. "Then you'll carry it, and the danger that comes with it.
But understand this, you've marked yourself now. There are others less patient than I. Without warning, he reached up, yanked the ladder from the opening, and let it crash to the floor. The trapdoor slammed shut above, sealing them in darkness once more. Your choice, he said, his voice retreating toward a shadowed passage Eleanor hadn't noticed before. Now find your own way out and decide what matters more, the relics or your life. His footsteps faded, swallowed by the labyrinth. Eleanor stood motionless, heart pounding, the key still clutched in her fist. Somewhere in the blackness the chest waited, silent, heavy with secrets that no longer felt like hers alone. 3 weeks later, the ruins of St. Aldwyn's were empty again, their crumbling arches silent under the sweep of winter wind. Eleanor stood at the edge of the nave, her boots sinking slightly into frost-bitten earth. She had not been back since that night, until now. The chest was gone. She had known it would be. The moment she'd stumbled out through a collapsed tunnel that night, filthy and half-frozen, she'd understood the man in the dark coat hadn't left her in the chamber by accident. He had given her a choice, but he'd also made his own. The relics had vanished into whatever shadowed network still guarded them, just as they had for centuries. What remained was the Bible. She had returned it quietly to the church archive,
replacing it in its dust-covered niche as if it had never left. Only the margins were different now, the delicate marks gone, the parchment clean and unblemished. She wasn't sure how or when the code had been erased, but she knew the message it had carried no longer existed for anyone else to find. In the weeks since, Eleanor had caught herself scanning faces in crowds, wondering if the caretaker, or others like him, were watching. She received no threats, no warnings, just silence. Yet she felt the absence of the relics like a weight she could still feel in her hands. Greaves had been right. Curiosity was dangerous, but it was also, she realized, a kind of duty. Even if the relics were gone from her reach, she had seen them. She had walked into a place sealed by centuries and touched the past with her own hands. That knowledge was hers to keep and to guard. The church bell in the village below began to toll, its sound drifting up through the cold air. Eleanor turned her back on the abbey and started down the path toward her car. The frost crunched underfoot, the wind tugged at her scarf, but her thoughts were steady now. Some truths, she thought, belong in silence, not because they aren't worth telling, but because they demand more than the world can bear. She tightened her coat and quickened her pace. Somewhere out there, the relics still existed, hidden beneath the watch of those who believed in them enough to protect them at any cost. And if the time came when they were needed, perhaps the Bible, or something like it, would find another pair of hands. Until then, Eleanor would wait. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph,